Welcome to The Front Porch, a program dedicated to turning back the pages of time and discovering the rich history and culture of our Northeast Georgia area. Join us now with your host, local historian and writer Bobby Watson, and this week's special guest.
Oh, hi everyone. Well, welcome back again to The Front Porch. I'm here with my friend Dan Hayes. Dan, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Bobby.
For those of you who may not know Dan was for a long time, not for a long time, but he was mayor of Tallulah Falls. When was that, Dan?
I got elected in 2016.
2016.
Mm-hmm.
And we are working on a book, Habersham 200. And we're celebrating our bicentennial year here in Habersham County, and not just in Habersham County, but Habersham County, Hall County, Gwinnett County, Walton County. They were all born on the same day, December the 15th, 1818. And so, of course, 2018 here, Dan, is our bicentennial year. That's and awesome. We're trying to learn as much as we can about the history of Northeast Georgia. And you caught me here taking a look at and holding this little model of the TF Railroad.
Tallulah Falls.
Yeah, and Dan, I know that that you live up in Tallulah Falls. Of course, being mayor, I guess you'd have to live in, in Tallulah Falls. But tell us a little bit about what it was that drew you to Tallulah Falls, because I know you're not from there originally, and just tell us a little bit of what attracted you to Northeast Georgia, and what attracted you to the beautiful area there around Tallulah Falls.
Well, first, I want to thank you for inviting me to
Sure.
the porch. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and I'm the former mayor, and Mayor Dobbs wants to thank you and the production crew for allowing me the opportunity to represent
We're happy
the council.
to have you here.
To tell the story of Rufus Lafayette Moss Sr. He was a visionary, and he was basically an industrialist. I became interested in it when I found out the house history. And I did.
And he had something to do with bringing the railroad in. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And he built a house right there on the railroad.
Right there. Well, he actually built the house before the railroad was built.
Really?
Yes, sir. I was born and raised in Atlanta and went to Atlanta DeKalb schools. I'm an Eagle Scout, class of '74, and I got a lot of history in me about loving history. I don't know why I got the history bug, but I love history. Why I came up here was our business. We had a parts route delivering parts for automobiles in the 80s and 90s. We still have it today, but back then I was the guy. I got in the truck and came up here, and as I passed through on the old road, and it was 2-lane back then, there was not a 4-lane road that we know today.
Right.
It used to take forever to get
you
from
had to go right through downtown Cornelia and right through downtown Demarest to Clarksville, right on up there. Yeah.
From Lawrenceville, Georgia, where our business is, all the way to Franklin, North Carolina, took all day.
Yeah.
I might not get home at 8 or 9 at night. But the thing was, I fell in love with Tallulah Falls in the gorge.
Were Stuckey's there then?
No, it was gone by the time I had got there.
Okay.
The post office was there on the side of the cliff.
Yeah.
But when I first moved up here in 1996, Bradley Brown was the mayor of Tallulah Falls. He was the first person to reach out and make a friend of me. I just found out through him, his father, John Brown, was an engineer on the train, and he told me the story of how he would ride that train when he was a kid to Tallulah Falls. They'd stop and have lunch and go up to Mr. Moss's house to have lunch, and that Miss Moss would fix them a lunch.
So it was right next to the depot.
Right there.
Yeah.
It's right there, and they owned it all. I mean, this document here goes back 140 years, and it is a title
of the house itself.
Of the house and the gorge and everything Moss owned.
Oh, how about that?
It's got prints, it's got drawings. But Keith York did that for me.
And of course, let me make sure that those of you who are visiting with us here on the porch know exactly what house we're talking about there, Dan, because when you go up to Tallulah Falls, you can see where the old depot is. It's kind of been restored. I think they're using it for storage now. But right behind it is a big white house. For a while, it was Isabel's Restaurant.
That's correct.
Up there. So Rufus Moss, who is one of the financiers and one of the people who really had a lot to do with bringing the railroad up there, that was his home. That's now where you live.
That was his second home.
His second home.
If you can imagine a man that could buy and put enough money into properties to own what he owned land from Turnerville. This document shows he owned land from Turnerville to Wolford Valley.
Oh, how about
up
that?
in Rayburn County. And of course, yes, he had partners, but the man was amazing because he was a lieutenant colonel in the Civil War in Cobb's Legion in Athens. And he was injured in Florida somehow in a fight down that far. But he come back, and all these guys that survived the war were really, really wealthy people. And his father had a 20,000-acre cotton plantation in Oglethorpe County. Well, Moss started in the cotton business, and he ended up owning the Princeton and the Whitehall cotton mills in Athens. He had 2 banks. He had an insurance company, steam engine company.
Wow.
He had Pioneer Paper Company. Now, he had partners, but you have to understand, he was like the Rupert Murdoch of his day.
Yeah.
And our county needs to recognize him as one of the insight guys that had a vision to do something. Because after the Civil War, the railroads were destroyed in Georgia. Georgia was broke.
Right.
My thing is, how in the world did that man have enough money to come up here?
Well, you know, I was just thinking about the rebuilding after the Gone with the Wind.
Exactly.
You're watching Gone with the Wind, and you get to the part after the war, and they're trying to rebuild. That was a life that he had.
That was the life of Moss. Now, you know, his thing was at the time the capital was in Milledgeville, and everybody doesn't realize Atlanta was not the capital, but that was the railroad hub, and Atlanta was basically where all the railroads came together. Well, the Union Army destroyed all our railroads. So Moss couldn't get his cotton out. They still had cotton down there because East Georgia, the line that Sherman went through, carried it south and east of Athens. Athens really didn't get hurt. So there was a lot of cotton, and they decided to keep milling it and sending it, wanted to send it out to the western states and territories. And the dream was to carry the road up to the Nashville-Knoxville line. And it never happened, of course. It stopped at Franklin, North Carolina. But Moss had a vision.
Yeah. Well, he had, at that time, as you mentioned, the railroads were destroyed. Of course, everything was destroyed in and around Atlanta. And, of course, after Sherman's march to the sea, most of the state had to be in a thing of rebuilding. But up here, where we are now, there was no railroad at that time.
Nothing.
And nothing at all. And if I'm not mistaken, Dan, there in Athens, where he was, they actually, it was kind of like a short line that would then connect to Atlanta and then to points beyond.
That's what his line was, is a short line railroad.
But in order to get his products from Athens, then this is after the Civil War, there was no railroad that came up through here in Clarksville or Cornelia, and the Southern Crescent had not been built yet.
No.
And so I can understand how he was trying to figure out all kinds of options to get access to Athens. I tell you, that's really interesting. In just a minute, we're going to come back and talk about that line that came up from Athens, would join with eventually the Southern, what we call today the Southern Crescent Railroad. And then, of course, as it leads up to you, the TF Railroad. So,
absolutely.
Dan, I appreciate you being with us.
Thank you.
And we're going to be back in just a minute, and we'll talk a little bit more about the TF Railroad itself. Tallulah Falls, toll failure, some of them called it.
Exactly.
But we'll learn a little bit more about the TF Railroad when we get back in just a minute.
Don't go away. There's more talk coming up on the front porch. We'll be right back.
Well, welcome back, everyone. We've been having a wonderful conversation here with Dan. Dan, I appreciate you being with us. Dan Hayes. It's great to have you here on the front porch. And we've been talking about Tallulah Falls, and especially the Tallulah Falls Railroad, and especially Rufus Moss. Rufus Moss is a name that we don't often associate with the railroad until now. Hopefully we can learn more about this guy who had a lot to do with the early days of Habersham County, and especially Tallulah Falls. And we were talking a moment ago, Dan, about the railroad coming up from Athens.
Correct.
Now then, let's put everything in perspective here, because they actually started building the airline road that would have come from Charlotte to Atlanta, which we now know as the Southern Crescent. That's the road that actually created Mount Airy, Cornelia, Baldwin, and in a way Alto, even though that town existed there, and of course Lula and on down the road. Those are what my friend John Collick, late John Collick, used to say were cross-tie towns.
Correct.
But the railroad did not exist after the Civil War.
No.
And so when you look at a map, it's interesting for me to see that, because you have railroads everywhere, but you don't have a direct link from Charlotte to Atlanta and to the points south. It was that you had to go out of the way.
That's right.
And so Rufus Moss, you're saying, had something to do with the creation of some of these railroads, not to move people, but to move what? Cotton.
To move cotton, textiles.
Yeah.
See, the way this started was he had several friends that were in the textile business. One of them would be later Governor Hardman.
Yeah, right.
Which most of the town of Commerce back then was called Harmony Grove. And Hardman asked him if he would run that line up there past his mill.
Right.
He would partner up with him with cotton and textiles.
Right.
Because he wanted to move product through as well. And there were several of those guys that had textile interest.
Right.
And partnered up with Moss to, basically the town of Nicholson, Georgia. Nicholson was Rufus's partner.
Right.
In the railroad. So they had a reason to build it.
Right.
And they came this way because, like you say, the airline road was already on the maps. And he knew if he could get it to come this far, he could take his textiles to New York City. But he envisioned even a greater thing by trying to cut through the mountains. To me, one of the most difficult things that he did was to try to cut through the mountains to take that road up to the Nashville, Knoxville, east-west line. That line actually follows I-40 all the way out west.
That's right.
I don't know the name of it, but it's a major line he wanted to tap onto.
And I know that's probably one of the reasons that they started the TF Railroad. Of course, it was not called the Tallulah Falls Railroad to begin with. It was called what? The Blue Ridge Railroad?
The Northeast Georgia Railroad Company was incorporated by the state of Georgia legislature in May of 1870, and it started in Athens.
Okay.
Then they got up here to this town, and it was basically a subsidiary. The Tallulah Falls Railroad became a subsidiary of the Northeast Georgia Railroad.
Now, I remember, Dan, in fact, I think I have a map from right after the Civil War that showed that railroad, as it was originally laid out, would have come up, as you just mentioned, through Harmony Grove, which we now know as Commerce. And it would cross over about where Lula is, and Lula is a cross-tie town, so it was created by the railroad. And it actually showed it crossing on up and going on up at that direction. I think it's possible that Moss and then the Hurt brothers, who worked with him, the Hurt brothers were the engineers, civil engineers. If people are familiar with downtown Atlanta, which where you're familiar with, the Flatiron Building, right at 5 Points.
Correct, right at
the
5 Points.
Hurt brothers built that in, I don't know, sometime the 1870s, but they were civil engineers that I'm sure were hired by Moss and other people who were financing this project to build that railroad up. And as that railroad came from Athens, he envisioned a bigger town. He envisioned Cornelia, Georgia, being where today Lula, Georgia is. Because at that time, the railroad was going to work out its way a different way, according to that map.
Correct.
Now, I don't know about any deeds or anything. I don't think any property was purchased. But of course, you quickly realize that all you need to do is to tap on to the new airline road coming from Charlotte to Atlanta, which we know today is the Southern Crescent, and it's going right up the ridge to what is now Cornelia.
Correct.
And from there, you could continue to follow basically the Continental Divide.
Exactly.
Because, of course, now we know Georgia 365, what we know as Georgia 365, does actually go along the Continental Divide. In fact, when I used to do tours, and in fact, I like to ask people, even they're just in my car, give a little riddle here. If you're coming from Gainesville to Cornelia, what is the one thing that you will not see between Gainesville and Cornelia on Georgia 365? The one thing that you don't see at all, and that is a creek or a river. because you don't go over any bridges.
Correct.
Any bridges that you go over are road bridges or railroad bridges.
Correct.
Because you're actually on the Continental Divide, all more or less.
It's a ridge.
That's right. The rain to the right of Georgia 365 is heading up into the Savannah River. If it's to the left, you're going to the Chattahoochee and ended up in the Gulf of Mexico. So that the railroad was able to take that same ridge and get up there, and then they envisioned it going up piece by piece by piece, further on up. But eventually Moss ends up there in Tallulah Falls. What year was that? Number one, when did he build his house? I know you've done a lot of research on it. When did he actually start construction of that house?
These deeds go back to where he bought the land in 1875. The house was built in 1879. The railroad didn't reach Tallulah Falls till 1882.
Okay.
At that same time, him and his son, Rufus Jr., built the Cliff House Hotel, was the first huge hotel on the gorge. And that was done because Rufus Jr. went out west to stay at the Cliff House Hotel on the Pacific Ocean. They said, well, while we're doing all this, why don't we just let people enjoy these beautiful waterfalls?
Sure.
They hadn't even thought about it because he bought Tallulah Gorge so he could take the railroad over it. People want to know, why did he buy the gorge? It was to get the railroad over it. He didn't know how he was going to get it over it.
Yeah.
But where the lake is today, that part of it he sold to Georgia Power.
Right.
There's about a 90-foot waterfall underneath that lake. And that's the waterfall people used to come to see.
Right.
And that was the challenge. How do we get that railroad over Tallulah Gorge? Yeah. So for many years, the terminus was right there in Tallulah Falls.
I think I've seen maybe images of it and a model of it where they actually had the turntable there.
Exactly.
Turn the thing
about right in the middle of where old 441 is, in between that restaurant that's there in the depot, was a turntable.
Yeah. And
they'd turn it around right there and send it back.
And I know that I do a lot of studying and writing about Demarest. And Demarest had a Chautauqua event there. The first one is in 1893, and the second was 1894. I do have one of the original programs for the 1894. One of the big deals was that excursion that would take them from Demarest up to Tallulah Falls to see that. Listen, let's talk a little bit more about the falls themselves, Tallulah Falls itself.
Sure.
And about your house, because I'm interested in that house. I kind of hope that you'll be able to keep that house and maybe let some of us take a look at it one of these days, because
trying to get it back the way Moss had it. I'm putting it back to the 1800s. When you walk inside, when I'm done, I give myself 10 years to do it.
Yeah.
And when you're done, when you walk in, you'll think you're in the 1800s.
How about that? That's going to be funny.
You'll think that when you open that door, it is going to go back to the era of Moss. It will be everything in there, marble top furniture, tables. I've already started purchasing a lot of furniture and putting in the house. There's a lot to do, but I've basically been doing a lot of work on the outside first just to get the place. It was in such bad shape. Yeah. I had to put a roof on it and paint it.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, Dan, in just a minute, we'll come back and I'll talk a little bit more about that and talk a little bit more about the town. And appreciate you visiting with us here on the front porch. Stick around for us for just a minute, because we've got a lot more to talk about here with our friend Dan Hayes. We'll be right back.
Don't go away. There's more talk coming up on the front porch. We'll be right back. With cable television production studios in Habersham and Towns counties, you're watching Windstream Cable Television Channel 4, home of local origination programming in North Georgia. From weekly church services to sports and community events, we've got you covered. Join us 24/7 for local programming at its best. Windstream Cable Television. It's what people are watching.
Welcome back to the porch. Dan, it has been fun having you here because we have a different perspective on Tallulah Falls because of Rufus Moss. And I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. I have read that name before. I was a little bit aware of him because I have done a lot of study on the Hurt brothers I was talking about a while ago, the actual people who built it. And trying to learn more about the TF Railroad. We learn a lot about the TF Railroad, but sometimes we don't know about the people who financed it and actually were influential in getting it up here. And I know that now you are living in Rufus Moss's house, the one that he built, and you said in the 1870s, before the railroad actually came through.
That's correct.
And it was his like summer home?
His summer home.
And he came up here. And of course the railroad came in, it was terminated there for a while, so it was a terminus. And it's at that time, I know because I have actually seen some of the publicity and some of the tickets and etc., where people were making excursions all the way from Atlanta
Absolutely.
up to Tallulah Falls in a day trip. And then, of course, it did eventually went on up into the mountains and into Franklin.
Correct.
And if you want to know what happened to the railroad, all you have to do is drive between Franklin and Sylva, North Carolina today. And what do you have to do? You have to go up this huge mountain.
Yes.
And, of course, that was the doom for trying to get up there.
The financing just wasn't there.
It was not there, and it was too big of an engineering feat probably
Absolutely.
at that time to do it, so that they didn't pursue that. So that Tallulah Falls was really kind of doomed from the beginning. I don't think it ever made money except for 1 year, and that was the year that they filmed
The Great Locomotive Chase.
I think there was a couple of films that had something to do with the railroad. I know The Great Locomotive Chase, is that right?
That, and I Climbed the Highest Mountain. They used a lot of footage.
I know they came in
at the Demarest Depot.
Demarest Depot.
At the Demarest Depot.
The Demarest is the first stop on the TF Railroad, mile marker 4. And, of course, that's one reason that the people in Demarest that wanted to create Demarest, it was very convenient for them there, and that's a whole other story. We'll talk about that on another episode of The Front Porch. But right now, I want to talk about the effect that railroad had on the falls themselves. And I know that you had a glory years there of just a few years.
Yes, correct.
70s, when the railroad came up
all
there
the way
in
up till about probably the turn of the century, about the 1900s, when the automobile started. That kind of was the high point for that railroad.
That's right. Well, of course, Georgia Power got interested in Tallulah Falls.
Yes,
and
did.
So actually, Georgia Power was needing power for their trolleys and etc. in Atlanta. That was even before AC electricity was predominant, but they needed to get it down there 90 miles so they could power those trolleys into town. And so they decided that was a natural place to put hydropower.
That was the first hydro dam in the state for power to go statewide. There were a lot of little dams built all around for miniature power plants for people's own use.
Oh,
but
yeah.
that was the first. It's basically the home of Georgia Power. It's where they started.
First major, and of course, a lot of those small generating facilities, just like Nora Mill over when you go into Helen. Nora Mill was a DC powered, so they were the DC power and the AC power is like the old times with the Betamax tape and the VHS tape.
That's
you had to figure out which was going to be used. In fact, I think that Edison was probably till the day he died, and Henry Ford the same way. They did not like alternating current. They thought it was dangerous and should not be used. I think it was 1913 that they actually first sent power out of the power station there.
Rufus Sr. sold part of the gorge to Georgia Power in 1909. There's documents here that say that they had made a deal, and Helen Deutsch Longstreet was against it.
Sure, but of course that was General Longstreet's widow.
Correct, but she lost because the legislature wanted it. State legislature got involved, and they pushed this thing through.
Right.
Because they knew electric lights were the thing.
Right.
After Edison and J.P. Morgan was his financier, did it in New York with Niagara Falls, then all of a sudden it became a necessity for the South.
Right.
We had to have our own. So Tallulah Gorge served another purpose, is to provide the power for Atlanta.
I think it's interesting because Tallulah Falls, Tallulah Gorge, the Tallulah power plants that are there, and there's several up there.
We have three inside our city limits, but there's about 5 on the line.
On the line, and you just mentioned Niagara Falls. The basic architecture, the basic engineering of the big, massive power plants at Niagara Falls and the ones at Tallulah Gorge are basically the same.
Same thing.
They basically dam up the water,
That's it.
get plenty of water, and actually take it through tunnels underneath
Yes.
the ground
Tunnels.
until they can put it down flumes and increase the velocity of the water so they can get much more power out of the water because of the way it's
The
designed.
tunnel, but that does it right there in town, is 5,000 feet long.
How about that?
It's almost a mile.
So when you're driving over the
4-lane, you're going
historic
over the
441
tunnel.
up there.
You're going over the tunnel.
Right over
and
the tunnel.
What used to be the railroad bed, a lot of people don't realize the 4-lane now follows
That's right, the
around
railroad.
the way the railroad bed come around the corner
Right.
and turned into the depot.
Right. And if it's wintertime, the leaves are off the trees and leaves are off the weeds and bushes, you can actually see that cut
Yes.
there,
Yes, you
exactly
can.
where it was. And
you
of course, if you go the old route, the old original 441, one you were talking about going back when you used to be in the old days when you first discovered
It goes right in front of the Moss House.
It goes right in
Right in
front
front
of
of
it.
Moss House.
But it will go when you're on the lookout, the old original lookout, Tallulah Falls lookout little
The point.
point, yeah, the point there. And as you're going down, the train will be on the falls, the gorge side
You can
of the
still
road.
see the cut.
You can still see the cut
You
through
still
there.
see the cut.
I would have loved to have been in that railroad.
Oh, I would love to have ridden on it
up there.
myself.
And
I really would have.
yeah, I would love to see it. And I know it made an ideal thing for the Great Locomotive Chase, which I
That-
think we need to see again. I think the Great
That and
Locomotive Chase.
I climbed the highest mountain both, but the Great Locomotive, one reason Moss wanted to go that route was the valley up in Clayton. It was the floor of between the mountains.
Wolf
So,
Fork Valley there.
Yeah, that whole valley up
Right.
going toward Dillard.
Right.
Man, he had a great railroad bed because it was the floor of the valley.
Sure.
So it was level and straight for miles up through there.
That's right.
another reason they wanted to get it over the gorge so they could get to that point.
Right.
But they had so much blasting to do.
And
back then.
there again, now when you're up there, it's very easy to look over there and see where
it.
they built up,
you
where they
can
built
actually
it.
see the railroad bed going through the valley. They
Yeah.
haven't done away with it.
Yeah, and I think that's cool. And even though lots of them have farmed on either side of
Yes.
it, they have kept that.
They've
you
kept
can
that
see where-
mound there.
And I'm glad that they've done that too. Well, Dan, it's been very interesting to have you here and to learn more about Rufus Moss.
Been an honor.
I know you're passionate about him, and I hope that people who are listening today will pay close attention because the book Habersham 200: New Thoughts of Old Ideas. We'll be talking a lot about this when we talk about Tallulah Falls. We'll be mentioning about Moss and many of the other people who had a lot to do with developing the Tallulah Falls Railroad. And I hope you'll be looking for it. It should be released sometime late summer, 2018. And it's great to be able to take this bicentennial year and take a look at our history once again and learn some of the things that really are not written now about our
I agree.
in our history
Find
books.
more and more every day.
Isn't that great?
Awesome.
Well, listen, Dan, I hope you can come back and visit with
Thank
us
you
again
very
before
much,
the
Bob.
bicentennial is over. And we thank you for being a part of the Front Porch. You are always welcome here on the porch. And we have a lot more wonderful people who we plan to visit with here on the porch. Thanks for being here with us. We'll see you next time.